Just before we kick off with the first guiding question to our panel, I wanted just to offer some framing headline issues that really arise from analysis ALERT is finalizing, which reviews the critical intersections between the pandemic, peace, and security. It basically asks the question, how far are peace outcomes currently being factored into our pandemic responses? So recognizing that the pandemic's interactions with conflict dynamics are necessarily complex, right? I mean, it seems already evident that we're seeing increase in all forms of violence. So for example, recent analysis in the Peace Economics, Peace Science and Public Policy Journal of ACLED data, which is some of the most reliable conflict data globally, seems to show or posits that, in fact, the world will emerge from the pandemic both more violent and less democratic than when it went into the crisis. And they analyze that is for two primary reasons, right? One, the obvious exacerbating effect the pandemic has on the root causes of violent conflict, and secondarily, political and military exploitation of the pandemic crisis by state and non-state actors. And of course, I guess most immediately and strikingly, we've also seen one of the impacts of the pandemic being a surge in domestic sexual and gender-based violence. So noting all this, how does that translate across, right? It would seem to dictate an imperative within the international response that peace building and conflict sensitivity be front and center in that response, both to the global public health crisis and to the post-pandemic recovery when we all edge towards that over the course, hopefully, of this and next year. So how's that going so far? So first, the good news. In terms of the international system's normative environment, its message received on peace building. So multilateral and bilateral, governmental and non-governmental, public and private, all the key actors have really stepped up normative commitments to sustaining peace, to recognizing the pandemic's impacts on peace and security, and more specifically, using the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus as a framework for strategy and programming. And within this space, there's also a welcome emphasis on integrated approaches and coordination, contextually driven responses, and localization. And I guess an additional element in all this, which is really infusing that normative environment, is we're continuing to see the reignition of the decolonizing aid agenda in the work, especially of George Floyd's killing in the USA and the rise of global anti-racist movements. And there's a lot of introspection now within the system on issues of structural discrimination and violence. So that's all good, right? You've got a complex multidimensional crisis, which is being reflected in a complex multidimensional normative environment. But what's the follow-through in translating that normative discourse into action strategy? Well, here the status update is mixed. There's good policy and there's strong practice, right, across multilaterals and bilaterals and international NGOs and governments. There's examples like the World Bank with its fragility, conflict, and violence strategy infusing every aspect of its response. There are UN system agencies like WFP, FAO, ILO, and UNICEF developing common conflict sensitivity methodologies. The UN Peacebuilding Fund itself, as Marc-André hopefully can go into more detail in just a little bit, approximately has about half or more than half of its programming right now that is pandemic responsive. And there's also, as everybody probably knows, pretty solid concepts around COVID responsive peace programming from international NGOs like Mercy Corps or World Vision International, as well as from bilateral actors such as the German or Swiss governments, the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. But there's also the devil in the detail of how strategy is made actionable. So it is great to release emergency funding for peace building, but how does that help address root causes of violent conflict, which are necessarily long-standing and deeply rooted? It's great to release emergency funding for peace building. How far does that funding reach beyond the big beasts of the system, most especially into the hands of local, on-the-ground peace-building actors? It is fantastic that there is a strong emphasis throughout on gender sensitivity and the pandemic's gendered impact. But the connective tissue between that recognition and conflict dynamics and peace outcomes is much weaker. although there are honourable exceptions even there in terms of the Swiss government, in terms of the UK government and Swedish Development Agency. So there is a strong uniform commitment to build back better, and through that a kind of passageway into achievement of the SDGs. But there's little consideration within that as yet of how the pandemic potentially swings a wrecking ball into Agenda 2030 for fragile and conflict-affected states, all of which were pretty much severely off track in achieving the SDGs even before the pandemic hit. And finally, there's a really excellent normative and strategic commitment to sustainable peace, but of course, funding to address and deliver that and to address violent conflict within the global COVID-19 response is lagging far behind. So right now, some analysis shows that, for example, of the total global commitment to COVID-19 response, approximately 0.3% of that, so less than 1% of that total commitment is directly factored towards peace building and conflict management. And that, of course, is at a time when economies globally are under great strain. Aid budgets will contract significantly as a direct consequence of this crisis. And that does leave peace building funding in grave danger of being what one multilateral donor described recently to International Alert as being a footnote to a footnote. So, bearing all of that in mind, both the good and the bad, the strengths and the weaknesses of peace building within COVID response thus far, let's turn to our panelists. So I'm going to ask you all panelists to try and keep your contributions, at least in this initial round, to 5 minutes each. That should give us time for 2 rounds of questions to you and 2 rounds of contributions, and then lots of time for questions and comments from the other people in our virtual room, from everybody to contribute. So, turning to you, Elio, we've talked about the multilateral system. We looked at the big picture. What's the ground reality like in Lebanon, a country facing multiple crises all at once? So over to you.
For having me amongst you and for ensuring a grassroots organization representation at such an important platform. First of all, I would like to just give a brief on the context in Lebanon at the moment, as the Lebanese and refugee communities are facing various overlapping crises in Lebanon, which is already a conflict-affected country with inter- and intra-communal tensions. So adding to the already difficult situation that the country was going through initially, and the tensions between the host and refugee communities, protests started in October of last year against the Lebanese government and its leaders. The economic situation was already in deterioration and has gotten even worse ever since. Banks limited the ability of persons to withdraw USD cash from their accounts, while the Lebanese pound was and still is drastically losing its value. So this has led, in fact, to many people losing their jobs, many businesses to close, while pushing many under the poverty line and many to extreme poverty. So this is all, and we're not yet talking about the pandemic. So practically in February, March of this year, COVID-19, of course, hit the country, and lockdown began leaving many individuals, especially daily workers, working in low-skilled jobs and who depend on daily income to survive without any income. Finally, and most recently, the 4th of August Beirut port explosion, which happened and exacerbated the situation even further, taking the lives of many and leaving many homeless or with severe damages to their homes. So the entire situation in Lebanon shifted the country from somewhat a latent conflict or a fragile context to a very clear emergency situation at so many different levels, as I just mentioned. So, secondly, despite the fact that there have been various social solidarity acts and initiatives trying to support vulnerable individuals, what I've observed from the field directly is that there are many dividers or sources of tensions that used to be at a broader level, such as tensions at the level of political affiliations, religious backgrounds, nationalities, or social classes, have become even more acute and at a micro scale. For instance, between neighbors themselves or persons from the same community and background. So it has become a much more complicated mesh or layers of conflict. That is also mainly directly connected first to the slight difference between, let's say, individuals' income generation ability, but also mainly to the service provision from local or international actors, where if one family receives support, the other doesn't, it automatically creates tension. And the response, in fact, is much smaller than the gap left behind by the whole situation. Here, I would like to highlight the importance of conflict sensitivity approaches that are very, very specific or contextualized, even at different regions in Lebanon, because in Lebanon, there's a diversified demographics in Lebanon in general. So specifically when the service that is being offered is not at the level of, let's say, education or vocational training or PSS or any development activity, but at the level of the very basic needs, such as food, shelter, and medication. So it becomes very much more sensitive in this case. And third point, which is very important from my perspective, is that I believe the situation that local or international even actors that the local and international actors faced in Lebanon, where organizations who work in various sectors, such as development, peace building, and did not include within their work strategies to work in emergency situations or to respond to urgent needs, somehow like they found themselves in a dilemma of whether to shift their mandates and in a relatively short period of time or not. Other than adjusting their mainstream projects, of course, and ensuring the importance and continuity of those projects online and so on, will they take on a new role under emergency responses due mainly to the moral aspect of this dilemma? So I think this is one of the main challenges as local actors faced in Lebanon. So do those actors, let's say, under this immense pressure, take on new funding and delve into a new approach, or continue, in fact, with what they are best at and what they have been developing and working on for the past years? Add to that there's like the pressure might come directly from the staff themselves towards their community, also from a moral perspective, because they themselves and their families were amongst the directly affected by the entire situation. So here I've seen, or I've witnessed clearly, that there's like this dilemma that many of the local organizations have faced in response to the multi-layered crisis in Lebanon. How to move forward and how to adapt to this, despite originally having very different mandates, or despite having a different approach in working in the field. So that's from the field perspective. Back to you, Michael.
Many thanks, Elio. It's good to get some granular detail on how COVID-19 pandemic is kind of challenging peace-building, humanitarian, and development actors on the ground in Lebanon. Next, we will ask Elizabeth to really how we're going to handle this process is start with the kind of almost the street level reality of Basmeh Zeitooneh's work in Lebanon and Beirut, and then gradually kind of zoom out towards the multilateral system. At each step examining the kind of ground reality or the lived reality, plus how this may be changing peace-building practice in itself. And for that next step, from Lebanon to peace-building practice in general, I'm going to ask Elizabeth Lerooney. So, I mean, obviously, kind of human contact, face-to-face activities are an essential part of the peace-building process, right, of the toolkit. Whether that's dialogue or training or reconciliation processes, etc. What do you do when this isn't possible? Over to you.
In the ways that peace builders think and work worldwide, with disruptions in international and domestic travel, local and national lockdowns, and the need for social distancing, transnational and local peace builders have been confined to working from home and limited to virtual meetings and conferences such as this, with stakeholders, community groups, peers, and partners. The pandemic and the subsequent response to it has disrupted the pattern of work that peace-building organizations have been developing for decades. In terms of the way peace builders work, one critical anchor underpinning key assumptions and principles that guide peace building activities is based on intergroup contact theory. So peace builders work on the assumption that differences in values and interests can be resolved cooperatively among conflict groups through positive negotiation and mediation. This includes collaborative problem solving as a means to encourage conflict parties to jointly address problems and explore new and non-violent options to overcome differences. These spaces offer the opportunity to reconcile competing versions of the past and acknowledge perceived historical injustices through ongoing dialogue, mediation, and problem solving. More critically, though, peace-building processes assume that change in people, change in relationships, and change in systems is possible and necessary to resolve conflicts. All these assumptions are interwoven with the concept of human connectiveness, where people are brought together to tell their stories, histories, and their experiences as a means to attain transformative peace. So activities such as workshops, dialogues, mediation, trainings, consultations, focus group discussions, and all activities that involve bringing people physically together are the primary part of many peace-building approaches. Where we have used online or digital engagement, this has historically supplemented or supported such face-to-face engagement. However, with the pandemic, this has now been turned on its head, with the primary form of contact instead being mediated through the online world, and peace-building organizations in many cases shifting to virtual forums to allow them to continue operations as best as they can. What is clear is that the pandemic is challenging the basis of intergroup contact theory. If this becomes a status quo, we will need to consider the impact of this shift on peace building and consider what we lose when we remove human contact, but also what we gain. We can see this more clearly with peace negotiations, peace dialogues, and peace mediations. These are peace building practices deeply rooted in intergroup contact theory, which are now being challenged by the shift to the virtual space. These efforts at conflict resolution rely heavily on face-to-face interaction to build trust and consensus that contributes to sustainable peace. It is important as ever to find ways to continue to hold open channels for dialogue and space for mediation. We have seen some track 1.5 and track 2 mediation processes and negotiations are moved to online platforms. One example, for instance, is the Yemen Peace Track Initiative, a coalition of more than 250 Yemeni women within and outside of the country, using WhatsApp and Twitter and other digital platforms to continue to track ceasefire negotiations and engage in online consultations with the United Nations. However, we also need to problematize the level of success that dialogue started online with no prior trust-building engagement can achieve. International law has faced this challenge in the South Caucasus, where we experience greater difficulty in bringing new participants together online from across the conflict divides, primarily because the preparatory trust-building process of intergroup contact, which serves to overcome prejudice and stereotype and create some measure of confidence and safety, has not been possible to engage in due to restrictions in travel. Trying to conduct dialogue online was incomparable to being face-to-face. The transition of peace dialogue and mediation to the virtual sphere is an example of some of the inadequacies of online engagement. Ordinarily, peace building is a process underpinned by long-term trust building through face-to-face engagement, and we risk unraveling previous progress unless physical spaces that are available are reinforced along digital ones. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I understand a few people, at least within the digital room, have been having trouble hearing the audio and thus may have missed contributions and also some guidance on how we're going to run this panel. So just quickly to repeat that if you have any questions for panelists or reflections on what panelists are saying, how we're going to handle that is just write it up into the room chat function, which is in the bottom left of your screen, post it up, and I will read out that question or contribution to the panel. We ask you, when doing that, please try and do three things. Tell us your name, If you're affiliated with a group or institution, do tell us that too. And if you want your question or comment directed, at least initially, towards a specific panel member, let us know that as well so we can handle that correctly. Okay, so after Elizabeth's, again, kind of very granular practice-based observations, let's take a step into the multilateral system and ask Marc-André what's he seen in terms of adaptations in peace building within that system, right? So either peace-building actors reshaping their programming to be COVID responsive, or other humanitarian and development agencies incorporating peace building as a part of COVID response. Over to you, Marc-André.
We're kind of here in PeaceCon today, and really grateful to you, Mike, and International Alert for putting this panel together and for keeping this conversation that's so important going forward. And I was really happy to listen to Elio and to Elizabeth and to hear their experiences. A few things on how the multilateral system has adapted. I think the first thing I would say, Mike, is that the response overall has been far too slow, I would say, or very, very much delayed. What I mean is that the system has taken time to adapt and to integrate, I think, conflict prevention, to integrate COVID risk into its responses, the risk of violent conflict into its responses. I mean, there are some bodies, the General Assembly, the Peacebuilding Commission, were rather quick at raising the conflict risk from the pandemic. But of course, the Security Council took forever, in part because of geopolitics. And this did delay, I think, movement from the system as a whole. And then, of course, the world was focused really on the health emergency, and it really didn't help that peace builders, that UN staff, and international actors were confined at home. This, of course, didn't help us gathering information and improving our understanding of what was going on. There was a very long, I think, lag in this understanding. And you know, this has changed. I would say that this has now changed pretty drastically. We're now almost a year into the pandemic, and as you've mentioned, Mike, I think we've seen now a much clearer picture of what heightened conflict risk the pandemic has brought about. And as the Secretary General has highlighted to the Security Council, there's been really two drivers. The health crisis is not necessarily directly causing violent conflict, but certainly a lot of the, I would say, repressive responses from governments, the lack of transparency has increased hate speech, has reduced civic space, and on top of this, the economic crisis, the economic downturn. And what our colleagues on the ground tell us is that these two factors have indeed exacerbated, as you were mentioning, conflict risk, have increased inequalities, and certainly we are going to suffer the consequences of this pandemic from a conflict prevention point of view for decades. And so that's why I think this conversation here today is so important. I would also say that, especially if I compare to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we do have, as an international system, as a peace building community, much more experience in integrating new risks into analysis and into our responses. And I think we have seen this now in action. And let me give you a few examples. First, the governments, with the support of the UN system, have developed what we call socio-economic response plans. So there are now 74 countries that have such plans, and there's 109 countries where the UN system has its own socioeconomic response plan for the pandemic. And in those plans, almost all of them, to different degrees, have integrated risk of violent conflict into them. And those risks are about of 6 types. Border risk at the border, insecurity at the borders, broadly defined insecurity, gender-based violence, elections, delayed elections and governance issues, delayed peace processes or stuck peace processes, and heightened climate risks. And so I'll share with in this chat and the latest analysis of those plans, and also links to find those plans for those who are interested. But, you know, by and large, they have a reflection of how conflict prevention, how those new risks need to be factored into the overall socioeconomic plan. So we see, as you were saying, a great attention to the humanitarian development peace nexus in those plans. Second, the global humanitarian community launched, of course, a COVID-19 appeal specifically geared at the new humanitarian needs out of the pandemic. But now, the latest global humanitarian overview that was launched on December 1st integrates COVID-19 as one of those risks. And you'll see that needs have gone up by 40% as a result of the pandemic. So the humanitarian community, again, integrating those risks of the pandemic in the needs assessment. And so I think that has also gone. And really, you've mentioned some of them, Mike, yourself, but to various degrees now, many agencies, funds and programs, humanitarians, but also typical development agencies, FAO, of course, UNDP, UNICEF have rolled out tools that now integrate COVID-19 as an additional risk into their program. And the Peacebuilding Fund, more particularly, we have integrated questions about how COVID is increasing inequalities, what potential violence can be expected from it in all of our conflict analysis and all of our eligibility processes. So those have been opportunities. And as you've mentioned, more than half of the programs of the Peacebuilding Fund have now adapted and integrated conflict risk using networks that were in place, using programs to integrate COVID, but also responding to new opportunities, I would say. In Madagascar, working with the security forces to improve engagement with citizens on COVID, improve also trust between citizens and security forces. In Haiti, taking the risk of COVID as an opportunity to fast track judicial processes and reduce prison population. In Burkina Faso, reducing insecurity at the borders and improving social cohesion in the borders. So a lot of new ideas, and I must say, both for the SURF in the humanitarian community, the SDG fund managed by the Development Cooperation Office, and for us at the Peacebuilding Fund, all of those proposals are joint proposals, not only between UN agencies, but between civil society organizations and the UN agencies. So I have been quite impressed about the effect of, I would say, the pandemic in encouraging agencies and international actors to work together. This has also, I think, been the case now with rollout of more joint initiatives between the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN in terms of joint analysis to underpin each other's new programming and new agreements with government. So overall, quite a bit of, I would say, delay, and we could have done better in terms of rolling this out and responding quicker. But certainly a lot of positives and integration and an adaptation of conflict risk into the overall response. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Marc-André. Building on that, I mean, you've kind of set out very comprehensively a number of examples of where that risk and the centrality of peace building to answering that risk is being built into planning, given quite a range of programming examples. But I'm wondering, over to you, Daniel, from your perspective, how are you seeing the reality of adaptiveness and peace responsiveness in the international system? You know, there's policy commitments galore that's integrated into planning. Is that following through? And how are the imperatives of the pandemic reshaping that?
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining our session. So I'm coming from Interpeace, which is an international organization for peace building that predominantly works at the local level, working through mostly local actors or through locals on peace building. And I guess I want to talk to you today, answer Mike's question, but also talk about some of the work that we've been doing with much larger development humanitarian organizations on trying to instill more conflict sensitive and what we call peace responsive approaches and how they actually operate. And I think partly what that's about is acknowledging that peace building is not something that just peace builders can do or have an impact on. You can, other actors, development actors, humanitarian actors, the way they work and the way they approach their work can be very important for peace outcomes. And it's really about trying to instill those peace building approaches in the way in which much larger actors work. Because we actually think that, you know, despite the fact that we've got a sort of footprint, Alert has a footprint, other peace building organizations have a big footprint. And there's many things we can do that actually, if we can influence much larger actors in the way they operate, that might actually have a pretty profound impact on the total collective impact for peace. I just want to come back to the framing that Mike had sort of put at the front, and I think it's really important, and it's been said several times, I think, in PeaceCon, which is the manner in which COVID-19 is being understood. And I think at the very beginning of the crisis, I think we were very concerned that it was just being narrowly understood as a health crisis, when I think it's fair to say that it is a multidimensional crisis. We've heard that word several times. I think it's really critical that it is, because multidimensional crises that affect livelihoods, food security, the social contract need to be addressed in a multidimensional way. And I think that's why we need multidimensional responses, and it does relate to the manner in which international actors are responding, because it does challenge a lot of traditional, I guess, very siloed ways of working. And in that sense, it's a big opportunity. So I think it's already been said that, you know, COVID is having a very big impact on conflict. We know that it's affecting the trust between state and society, trust between groups. I think Ilya gave some very good examples of that. We know that armed violence is increasing, and I think what's particularly unique is that the policy responses to COVID-19 are conflict-inducing, and I think that's quite unique to other sorts of crises. And for that reason, the issue of conflict sensitivity and what we would call peace responsiveness is not really an option for much larger international actors. We would say it's more or less compulsory. And conflict sensitivity has been around for a long period of time, but unfortunately has become a bit of a tick box. And I think what's been lost, and what we see what's been lost, is the fact that it's intimately connected to the effectiveness of technical interventions in the field. And I think Ebola is a very sad example of that. A response which we, Interpeace ourselves were working on in the early part of 2018, which at the beginning was not terribly conflict sensitive, resulted in a breakdown in trust between the international actors and the local actors, and as a consequence, the epidemic spread. And so you have this very important link between conflict sensitivity and effectiveness, which I think Ebola's exposed, I think COVID's now exposing, and I think that's profoundly important for peace building going forward. What we would argue is that what we're seeing is that there is a very large policy to practice gap. I think Mike really clearly outlined that there is a lot of positive movement at the normative level, but it's not really trickling down into action. And we actually need to really update the way we think about conflict sensitivity. And that's why we're describing this new approach of peace responsiveness, which is a much more intentional approach to addressing the conflict issues on the ground. It's not just reactive, it's not just palliative, it's trying to instill more conflict transformative approaches in the way in which other technical interventions are done. So, like, practically, what does that mean? And what are some of the work that we've done with some larger agencies like WHO, the ILO? I can provide some very quickly. Is one, it's working at the individual level, so working on training, working on strengthening understanding of participatory questionnaire design, participatory conflict analysis. It's about strengthening organizational capacities, so increasing the levels of guidance around conflict sensitivity. It is around improving M&E systems. It's around trying to get a lot of messy work at the design phase of programming, which is perhaps not the most visible type of work. But it's really important to try and get more participatory processes, connecting those participatory processes to good conflict analysis, and putting the conflict dynamics at the very front of whatever the technical intervention may be. And I can give many examples in the discussion, perhaps, of work that we're doing. But it's in that sort of very messy phase of work that I think a lot of the critical changes need to be made. And I think finally, it's not all negative. I think it's very important to highlight that COVID-19 is also a profound opportunity. I think, whilst it is exposing a lot of fissures and grievances, it's also raising a lot of issues that we need to talk about. And, if I look at the case of Libya, for instance, where we have a very large program, I mean, we did a large survey there, which exposed the fact that violence has increased very significantly, but also intimate partner violence, gender-based violence has also increased. That's a taboo topic. We're now having people talk about these issues when perhaps they weren't talking about them before. So there are many opportunities to leverage this crisis in a positive way for the future, and I think that's perhaps where we want to take our collective interventions going forward. I think the other very quick thing to say is that, Mike alluded to it in his introductory remarks, is that we have seen the localization agenda really stalling. I think the very fact, and Elizabeth was going through this in quite a lot of detail, the very fact that international actors can't be traveling to countries is really reinforcing the fact that it's what the capacities at the local level and what's built at the local level is the thing that is going to be able to deal with crises going forward, not just COVID-19, but the next crisis. And that local resilience is what actually is really the thing that we need to build going forward. And I think it's showing that locally owned, locally led approaches work. They're more effective, they're more sustainable, and I think that's profoundly positive. I think there's a lot more we can discuss about how that needs to be done, and perhaps we can get to that in the discussion, but I might end my comments there. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Very comprehensive. I actually wanted to, moving into the second round of questions to panelists, wanted to build on that whole issue around what opportunities does the pandemic present, and also build on a question that's already been posted into our room chat by a participant in the virtual room here, Chris Ryder, which is really perhaps turning to you first, Elizabeth, in terms of how you've looked at how peace-building practice is changing, right? What have you seen as the opportunities or advantages to this shift away from heavy international involvement to real concentration on local peace building capacity and expertise, and that shift into kind of a more digital realm? What do you see as the advantages and opportunities there?
In terms of advantages or opportunities, there are a couple that I want to touch upon. One of the advantages that we've seen being presented is the potential to harness the voices of young people. Some young organizations have noted that the shift towards the digital implementation of peacebuilding practices has positively positioned young people at the forefront and center of conflict-sensitive pandemic responses. COVID-19 and our increasing reliance on technology in our peacebuilding work may be an additional driver for enhancing youth participation and creating an inadvertent but welcome response to high levels of interest amongst young people themselves for greater inclusion and participation in peacebuilding. Typically for a group in all its diversity that has historically been othered or marginalized on the basis of perceived immaturity, if you like, these online adaptations to peacebuilding might offer an opportunity to diversify the seats at the table and include more young voices in decision-making and peacebuilding spaces. It's typically thought that young people find it easier to grasp new technological devices or new technology. While the potential for raising the voices of young people is clearly welcomed, we should sound a cautionary note. Older demographics who might have less access to and knowledge of technological platforms should not be overlooked, or else we risk a technological generational gap, which could potentially lead to the marginalization of these voices. It's also important that young people are not treated as a homogeneous group. Peacebuilding organizations need to consider and address inequalities between youth groups in terms of access to technology and digital literacy, which is often dictated by opportunity as well as geographic location. So really taking an intersectional approach to youth groups and not just lumping them in as one category. The other opportunity that has been touched upon already is that of the localization agenda. The pandemic may have created an increased momentum towards the localization of peacebuilding. Although this has been ongoing for a while with development, humanitarian and peacebuilding actors, there's always been an emphasis over the years on moving more systematically towards local peacebuilding and local ownership. The cessation or pausing of peacebuilding activities is an option really only open to donors and INGOs. For local actors, continuing to engage in peacebuilding is as much of a life or death issue as coronavirus, if not even more so. Many local peacebuilders have not been able to pause their efforts even when formal programs are put on hold. With the impact of the pandemic disrupting conventional models of carrying out peacebuilding work, particularly the grounding of international staff and advisors, or parachute experts, as some might call them, national NGOs and implementing partners of INGOs are better positioned to continue peacebuilding at a time when international travel is so heavily restricted. Local peacebuilders have been actively adapting their work to respond to the crisis using their contextual knowledge of conflict dynamics and roots in their communities to promote measures to combat the virus, deliver supplies to the neediest, and keep communication open among communities to maintain social cohesion in the midst of physical distancing. However, this also means that local peacebuilding organizations are likely to shoulder more health and safety risks without the backup of the international community. An additional risk is that of creating inequalities amongst local civil society organizations, where digital engagement tends to favor those that are more established and better connected, are more technologically savvy, but not necessarily fully representative. Grassroots organizations are therefore less likely to have any kind of visibility. It is important that in pushing the localization agenda, we are sensitive to local dynamics and inequalities and make sure that our efforts are bringing as many voices into the fold as possible. What local peacebuilders are doing is asking for support from international donors and organizations for flexible funding to help build capacity, technologies and tools to continue their work, including increased internet access, mobile phone time and other communication tools. However, there is still much to do to create the level of donor flexibility that program and organizations will need to survive. And it also remains to be seen whether there will be sustained donor appetite to fundamentally change the mode of peacebuilding funding and partnerships built over the years and create a financially viable space for local peacebuilders to take the lead, with technical and technological support being provided by INGOs and international organizations. Just one final point, I do want to add that as more organizations also shift their core peacebuilding work to the digital space, there are questions of marginalization or who has access to online platforms and who doesn't. We've just published a paper today titled, "Can We Build Peace from a Distance?" Which will be posted in the chat line. I do encourage you to read through that. And there we delve more into the issue of marginalization and the digital divide, including geographic and gender divides in more detail. Thanks.
Many thanks, Elizabeth. It seems that temporarily we have lost Marc-André Franche from the UN Peacebuilding Organization. Oh no, he's coming back. Excellent. Welcome back. Okay. So I think both you, Elizabeth, and Elio have spoken quite emotively about the kind of some of the challenges that the pandemic has presented in terms of local organizations sustaining their peace building and also responding to needs. I mean, you've talked about it being a life and death issue. Elio, you talked about it being almost a moral dilemma for organizations about whether they might shift their mission in order to meet urgent needs, for example. So Elio, I wondered whether you wanted to kind of help us understand that better from kind of a ground level perspective there in Lebanon. What does that look like to you as a peace building organization that is itself also responding to urgent humanitarian needs? How has the landscape changed for you?
Yes, thank you, Michael, for the question. So, despite the entire situation and context in Lebanon that I have highlighted in the first question, many of the work done on the field by local and international actors has been of like great importance and impact. And I'm going to mention a few things that have that were created due or within this emergency. So many local humanitarian actors who are, let's say, in direct contact with the affected communities have been directly contacted by international bodies to acquire this particular access and outreach ability. This was kind of a win-win situation to both sides, as funding was available for grassroots organizations and even to small groups and initiatives that particularly were created during this pandemic, while actors who have that funding but do not have the access to those diverse communities were able to gain that access relatively quickly, specifically within the pandemic limitations. So, in fact, many coordination groups have emerged during this period, with each group creating their own plans to respond at various levels and ensure geographical coverage of various affected regions. So, and moreover, like in addition to that, the recently observed increase in the number of projects run by consortia has become evident as well, which highlights the need for joint efforts for a larger scale project that can cover various regions in Lebanon. So adding to that also as a response to the emergency, so to create that kind of a balance between actors who do not usually work within the emergency field and for those who are used to working in a, let's say, more development-oriented work. So some peace-building organizations who themselves included within their approaches some modifications, some emergency response-related outputs, have also helped local actors build their own SOPs and generated conflict sensitivity tips that really, in fact, help improve their response in terms of emergency activities. However, this has come with also some downsides, knowing that the entire situation is completely new to everyone involved. The intervention modalities had to be drastically changed, and the conflict layers have also become way more complicated. So one of those downsides was bureaucracy. Like, for instance, has also greatly affected the efficiency of the work done on the ground. Delays had to take place in order for funding to reach organizations. Really extensive assessments had to be done prior to any form of action. SOPs had to be generated and put in place within, of course, a sensitive lens until it actually reached the most affected, despite the fact that the emergency situation itself, particularly in Lebanon, especially after the Beirut explosion, did not tolerate those delays and required immediate and impactful action. So this was kind of a gap there. And oftentimes, many of the quick initiatives that had to kind of come up, it could be created within this emergency situation, did not really take into consideration the do no harm approach and the conflict sensitivity approach as well. So looking forward, let's say, towards the coming year, now that we know that the situation will relatively look the same in Lebanon, in the sense like it will unfortunately continue within the emergency outlook, and the fact that host and refugee communities will remain around, their needs will remain around securing basic needs in a conflict-affected area. Basmeh Zeitooneh particularly, and I believe a lot of other organizations have, which used to allocate a very small percentage of their budgets and emergency or relief work from a strategic point of view, and usually focus more on development projects such as peace building, livelihoods, and education, now have modified their strategy, including Basmeh Zeitooneh, and will allocate a much larger percentage to the response towards the ongoing pandemic and economic situation. So that is also related to the first question when I was referring to the shift in the mandate. Finally, I would like to end this by saying that maybe I have a wish here that, since now it is somewhat evident that the dire situation, unfortunately, in Lebanon will continue, will be extended towards 2021, as either with new layers maybe, or even with just simply with the consequences of the series of events that took place this year. Maybe more alliances and not just consortia could be created to ensure that each entity remains within its area of expertise, offering support to other actors and key players in the community, while at the same time ensuring growth and development. So that's just a small thought that I wanted to drop, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Elio. I actually wanted to build on that next and reach back to you, Marc-André, and you, Daniel. I mean, there is this issue of even as, for example, there would be the positive aspect of emergency funding being available for peace building or peace building adaptation or peace responsiveness within COVID-19 pandemic response. There's kind of often a perverse kind of incentive, if you want to put it like that, built into that. You have to spend the money quickly, right? You have to program it, commit it, spend it quickly, and that in and of itself could sometimes degrade the ability to do the kind of nuanced, ground level contextual and local peace builder led responses that are necessary to have effective peace building impact. So just starting off with you, Daniel, maybe kind of pitch in that aspect. I mean, how do you see that kind of panning out? Do you see the kind of weight of example being around the pressure to spend, or do you see that kind of translating through to nuanced and contextual responsive peace building? And then also from your perspective, Marc-André, after Daniel, please.
No, thanks, Mike. I think it's a very important question, and I think it's a somewhat old one. I mean, I think one of the challenges for peace building is that a lot of our work requires long-term approaches, and so often we see these short-term funding windows, which, are simply impossible. It's build social cohesion in 18 months in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, it's not possible. And then you create a lot of bad incentives, as you say, to expend the money and just to get your a very output-driven log frame, which is a big part of the problem. I mean, this is very much related to conflict sensitivity and peace responsiveness. We argue for more relational, trust-building approaches, but the way in which you do that is often doesn't necessarily lend itself towards an RBM, results-based management framework. The pathway and the process for that is often quite idiosyncratic and not really in alignment with what donors ask for. Yet that's what we think is required. And so I think there's this persistent tension between the sort of adaptive management approach that we push for on the accountability side of the equation that donors continue to push for. And I think embedded within all of this is the tension between the short term and the long term, and we especially see that with larger humanitarian action. I think it's a big complaint that a lot of peace builders have, where enormous amounts of funding is allocated towards humanitarian quick response under the guise that funding will be spent very quickly. but yet we then see humanitarian actors, in conflict affected settings for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so these are not short term, but yet they're kind of thought of as being short term, but yet the thinking is short term. And so I think this is a major problem going forward, and I think it's been a concern that we had about the reactionary approach to COVID-19 funding. We saw that very early on. A lot of donors very quickly, generating, needed response plans, but then all the kind of bad incentives that come with that. So I think it's something that is a persistent problem. And I think we need to start looking at much longer term funding windows, but also more strategic plans that are actually funding on the premise of a real North Star, which is that funding going to help a country build its own resilience and sustainability going forward? And is it going to help the national actors lead in their own peacebuilding challenges? And so often we know that funding's not premised on that basic fact.
Thanks, Daniel. So, Marc-André, your perspectives on these kind of dilemmas, right? Short-term, long-term, contextually driven versus kind of pragmatic pressure to spend. What are your thoughts?
Daniel, what I would say in addition is, on the one hand, we need to realize that and continue advocating that the amount of funds that are provided for peace building and for conflict prevention in general is extremely small. So I think we need to keep that flag very, very visible and keep saying and telling the story that overall we're talking about very small amounts of money. And so having said that, I think a second part of what we need to continue advocating is that, especially in an unpredictable context that the pandemic has only compounded, we need to kind of unshackle ourselves from the slavery of the log frame. And here I think the UN is certainly guilty of that. Many bilaterals and those providing funding, that we are losing our way in demanding, and some of you just mentioned it before. Elio, you mentioned the bureaucratization of it. We spend an enormous amount of time demanding frameworks and log frames and indicators, when what we need, I think, especially now, is a lot more adaptative approaches where we have agreements on outcomes and very regular mechanisms to have a conversation about how things are going, and a lot more flexibility on the way to get there. And I think this is particularly important today, as we can't meet as we used to, as we need more creative ways of engaging. So I think that's really important, and we're not doing a good job, starting certainly with ourselves here in making a case with our donors. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that the environment is very positive for these kind of conversations, as many donors are looking at diverting funds to their own national responses. There's a lot of talk of reducing ODA funding. And so this is really worrying for us. It's certainly worrying for the Peacebuilding Fund and for the kind of work that you're all doing. But ultimately, I think we need to, it's really through influencing development budgets rather than the short-term emergency response funding that we will have the kind of sustainable impact over time. So it's a lot about making the big, multilateral more conflict sensitive, just to use the words we've been using in the panel, and making those funding vehicles more sensitive to partnerships with peace builders and peace building institutions, rather than trying to get more of that emergency funding and competing with humanitarian funding, if I may say it in that way.
Thanks, Marc-André. And I think that also speaks back or links back to Elio's previous remarks around kind of being bolder, I think, in seeking strategic alliances between a variety of different actors so that together you build that kind of more adaptive, comprehensive response across humanitarian development and peace-building actors. So there was one issue which we've referenced throughout the conversation that I wanted to dig into a little bit more now, which is the intersection of how the pandemic is reshaping peace-building practice with gender. So Elizabeth, I'm just wondering, you know, we're at a time, unfortunately, of some pushback against the women, peace and security agenda globally. And, you know, that was before the pandemic, and now the pandemic has hit. And as you eloquently described, it is reshaping certain aspects of peace-building practice on the ground in both positive and negative ways. Again, you know, looking at both the kind of the good and the bad, the opportunity and the threat, how do you see this intersecting with work around gender?
Thanks, Mike. In terms of the pandemic and the impact on gender, what we've seen is obviously the increase of GBV and domestic violence as more women are, as social distancing has come into effect, and women being stuck at home, potentially with their abusers. And then obviously the burden of caregiving as well during the pandemic being placed on women as well. So you've seen a global rise on domestic violence. What we've also seen is pandemic responses that tend to exclude women from the table. And at this point, women's voices are needed more than ever in terms of decision making, in terms of building back better, in a sense of building back more inclusive societies after this pandemic. So for me, when we see pushback, particularly in women's participation during the pandemic, that worries us in terms of how our society will look post the pandemic. So the intersection between COVID and gender norms, I think it's really relevant that we need to push the WPS agenda. We've had the 20-year anniversary this year. We've seen pushback in terms of the gains that have been made, rollback in terms of women's participation, and it's critical now than ever, more than ever, that we have women's voices, women's participation in decision making right now in terms of the pandemic response. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that clear clarion call. I just want to turn to now and build upon a question from somebody out here in the virtual room. And I also want to encourage people out there in the virtual room, post your questions into the room chat if you have them. We have time to deal with them probably. This is a question from Elena, and it speaks to you know, a very pertinent topic, and one I think that will only become more heavily emphasized as we move through 2021, which is the rollout of vaccines globally, right? So as Elena puts it, you know, we're at the time at the same time when we have several very effective, it seems, vaccine candidates or vaccines either at the edge of approval or being approved and actually rolled out in vaccination campaigns. At the same time as, you know, just this morning published analysis whereby the vast majority of the current vaccine pipeline is bought up by wealthier nations already, so that one can see that for poorer or more conflict-affected states, the eventuality of access to vaccine and vaccine rollout is going to be more distant, possibly, as well as all the complexities of vaccine rollout in societies, for example, where citizen-state relations may be quite strained, and there may be heavy degrees of exclusion or marginalization for certain populations. So Elena phrases it really well, which is, you know, what do panelists think about the kind of the current experience of the vaccine development and rollout? How would that might change the role of institutional strengthening to ensure equitable service delivery in peace through peace building for vaccine rollout? So maybe turning to you first, Daniel, I think. What are your thoughts around that?
And conflict is not a new one. I mean, we've seen issues in the Ebola response, wide distrust of that vaccine. We see very large issues in the current polio program in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Something that Interpeace has just started doing is to work with Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccination and Immunization, to look at the conflict sensitivity of how vaccinations are actually rolled out. And what we see, I mean, it's not new. I mean, in a lot of different global health vaccination programs, is pretty blatant failures of conflict sensitivity. I think the case of Ebola is a pretty classic one now. I think you will be seeing, case studies written of that and what not to do. And I think there's common threads to all these lessons. A lack of community engagement, too much of a top-down approach, and just too technical an approach. I mean, and I think this is the challenge for international actors and institutional strength is, so often, and if it's WHO approaching Ebola, the thinking is that it's a health crisis and the local populations don't necessarily perceive it as their number one priority, their number one concern. And they're confused why all of a sudden there's this huge amount of resources thrown to this particular illness when they have so many other development humanitarian challenges. And so this requires for us, I think, a change in mindsets of some of these larger technical actors, and to be able to put the conflict and the context first as opposed to the mandate. And that's still so persistently hard to do because of the way in which organizations work. In the case of Ebola, I mean, I think it's the case now with the polio program in Pakistan, which is currently being really looked at because there's very significant conflict between the program and the population. What we call this is often, is the Ebola is not about Ebola problem. That in order to address, say, Ebola or polio in these contexts, you actually need to address a whole number of other trust and developmental issues before you can get to that. And it's not until you address those issues first that you can actually get local trust addressed to accept vaccination. And so basically that is a dilemma because you're asking technical health actors to basically focus on things that are not their mandate. And it comes back to the multidimensional thing, and it comes back to collective impact, and it comes back to why peace building is so key as an approach, rather than just something that one set of actors do, or one thing that one particular organization does in a particular setting. It's something that all actors need to be working towards, and it's really that collective impact approach. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's sort of how I would see it.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads there, Daniel, so I think it is beginning at least to answer that question. And one of the most vigorously nodding heads I saw in terms of the panel was yours, Elio. You seem to have nodded along. I mean, what's your perspective on this critical issue as a Lebanese civil society organization around vaccine access, vaccine acceptability?
Exactly. This is the question. I think the question is very important here because it really highlights a dilemma that we will probably be facing very soon. As you said, most organizations that will be, or let's say entities that will be working on disseminating or distributing the vaccines will not come from this lens, from the conflict sensitivity lens, and that's a problem. And here, I was also wondering what could local or international actors do about that, especially that within the community in Lebanon, as you said, the economic crisis is way more important to them as a priority than the vaccine itself or the pandemic even. For some of the very vulnerable communities, let's say, even they still after a lot of, let's say, awareness campaigns, do not actually believe that the virus is of any importance. So this is almost the last thing they could think of, and that also will affect automatically, will create this kind of divide between those who are seeking the vaccine and those who are not, and also at the level of what the government will be providing and to whom, and what then the local actors or the international actors will be able to do to kind of create some sort of a balance, some sort of a way to ensure that no marginalization of certain groups is created. So this is definitely a dilemma to think more about in terms of what can actually be done. Back to you.
Thanks, Elio. Marc-André, do you have any kind of thoughts from your own perspective within the multilateral system around this issue? No? Okay, I'm gonna dodge that one. Okay, all right, so we have around 15 minutes left of this panel, and I wanted to kind of basically wrap it up by going back to each panel member in turn and asking a simple speculative question, which is, if you had the ability to hop into your own personal time machine and take a short jaunt to the end of December 2021, what do you think is the one big thing that the pandemic will have durably changed by then in terms of peace building or issues of peace and conflict? So what do you think is that one big thing in the peace building landscape at the end of 2021 which will look like a durable change due to COVID-19? So let's kick this off. Marc-André, do you want to have an initial stab?
Sure. I'm not very, I'm on today at least, I'm not very optimistic, I must say, given the conversations we're having with our colleagues on the ground. And I fear that we are behind the curve in terms of programming, in terms of engagement. And so if there's one thing, I think unfortunately at the moment, we are in a situation where funding and resources dedicated to peace building, and therefore our capacity to support, local peace building actors is under threat. And I think if I look at 1 year from now, I fear that tendency is going to continue, and that we'll be in a worse off situations from a resourcing point of view. I really hope, and we're going to work very hard to counter that. But unfortunately, I think that's where we are, and that's what I would say is our outlook at the moment.
Okay, challenging. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
Can you hear me? Yes. Maybe just to take another take. Maybe it's not just one thing. It's many kind of positive realizations. And I think that the main thing I think we may come to realize by the end of 2021 is that just the criticality of building local resilience and the many different manifestations that can take, and that, and this is perhaps scary, but maybe embracing that fear is that, COVID-19 is just one of many future challenges, and that in some ways many communities are actually more resilient now than before, and perhaps we can leverage that for positive change. And there might be not just one thing by the end of 2021 that shows that, but many, many, many thousands of examples of that. So that would be my kind of positive look into the future.
All right, excellent. Elizabeth, thoughts from you?
We've adapted to the digital sphere. I think moving forward to 2021, I don't necessarily see a return to the previous status quo before COVID. I think what we've learned, or what we will learn in the sector, is that we can do a lot of the work that we do online, and previously booking flights to this location, that location to attend so-and-so conference or web training session. I don't think that we're going to go back to that, which is great for global CO2 aviation emissions and the climate crisis. But I do think that we've shown that we can adapt. I do think face-to-face activities will resume, but not to the level that they did before. So I think I will attach that to the localization agenda. And I think INGOs, particularly staff based more internationally, the way in which they worked previous to the pandemic, I think that's going to change, has changed, and it will remain changed in 2021.
Okay, thank you. Elio?
Yes, from a quite particular context in Lebanon, it's really hard to kind of distinctively identify something like an outcome of the pandemic that we will see without looking at the whole picture. So there are so many layers to it, specifically economic and political, that I see that they're all intertwined and they're feeding each other in some sort of a loop. But anyways, in Lebanon, it's really dependent on the government reforms and whether they take place or not. So this is a very major issue that could be a game changer in this case. What will happen in a year from now? But generally, I do see a lot of the challenges, especially within a country that has been conflict-driven for so long and has a very large refugee population present in it. So this kind of challenges or the extension of what we've seen this year is probably gonna be for more than just 1 year. That's what I see, and yeah. So it goes more towards the more pessimistic point of view rather than optimistic, as my colleague was saying.
Okay, thank you, Elio. So we have a balanced panel in terms of optimism and pessimism, it seems. You know, on the one hand, we do have the kind of the absolute centrality of asserting peace building and peace responsiveness and conflict sensitivity as being absolutely fundamental, not only to an effective public health response, right, in terms of the pandemic, but to it, you know, core issues of peace and security and any effective post-pandemic recovery, especially in fragile and conflict-affected states. At the same time as a pessimistic viewpoint of the funding being available to do that. But on the plus side, the possibility that this reshaped context, right, for international peace building and peace building at ground level could really lead to an acceleration and a cementing of the localization agenda, and really a renewed emphasis on the critical role that peace building actors on the ground, local, grassroots, national, play in issues of peace and violent conflict within their own societies. So a lot to play for and a lot to work for. I think every one of us here on the panel, and I'm sure out in the virtual room, is 100% committed to carrying those efforts forward, right? To really asserting as much as we can the absolute peace building at the heart of pandemic response and pandemic recovery. Peace building being key to any ability that we have as an international community to salvage Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, especially in conflict-affected countries. And the criticality of really making the localization agenda real, right? Putting that power, accountability, and just sheer implementation capacity in the hands of as a local peace builder as possible. Okay, so we are indeed coming up to time. So I think I will wrap this up just by, of course, thanking effusively all of our panelists, Marc-André Franche, Elio Arias, Daniel Hislop, and Elizabeth Larooney. Again, the session's been recorded, so if you wish to return to it to refer to anything and anything that's been posted in the chat, you should be able to do so. And there's been, just to point out, there's been several interesting reports posted into that chat, so do check them out and download them. And thank you to everybody who stuck around in the virtual room through some technical challenges. It's been a very interesting and insightful conversation from my perspective, at least, and I hope that you enjoyed and found it valuable too. So thank you, everybody.